children notice things adults are trained to overlook. And that truth met me at a wedding table, dressed in white linen and polite smiles. I was sitting quietly beside my 5-year-old grandson, Oliver, my purse tucked under my chair, my hands folded the way they are when I'm trying not to take up too much space. It was my son's second wedding, and I told myself I was grateful just to be there. Second chances deserve quiet support, I'd thought. No opinions, no reminders of the past. Oliver swung his feet under the table, humming to himself, the way children do when the room feels too loud for their small bodies. Around us, glasses clinked, laughter floated, and the band tuned their instruments. Everything looked exactly the way a wedding should look: bright, hopeful, carefully arranged. Then Oliver stopped humming. He reached for my hand with a grip far too tight for a child his age. "Grandma," he whispered, leaning close enough that I could feel his breath on my wrist, "I want to leave now." I smiled automatically, the way women of my generation were taught to. "Sweetheart, we just sat down. Do you want some cake first?" He shook his head. His curls brushed my arm. "No, we need to go." I bent closer, lowering my voice. "Why, love?" His bottom lip trembled, not like a tantrum, like fear. "Haven't you noticed?" he whispered. "Noticed what?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes darted around the table at the guests, the candles, the neatly draped cloth, before settling on the space beneath us. His small fingers tightened around mine again. "That," he said softly, "under the table." Something in his voice made my smile fade. I followed his gaze, just for a second, expecting crumbs, shoes, maybe a dropped napkin, something ordinary, something childish. Instead, I felt a strange, cold awareness crawl up my spine. I didn't look fully, not yet. I've lived long enough to know when a moment is about to split your life into before and after, and some part of me wanted to delay the after just a little longer. "Oliver," I said carefully, "did someone scare you?" He shook his head. "No, but Daddy said we should be good today, and that means not talking about bad things." My heart skipped. "What bad things?" He leaned in again, his forehead pressing lightly against my arm. "The kind grown-ups pretend not to see." I straightened in my chair, suddenly aware of how loud the room felt, how distant the bride and groom seemed at the head table. My son looked happy, too happy, perhaps. The kind of happiness that asks not to be questioned. "Grandma," Oliver whispered, his voice barely a sound now, "can we go outside? Please." I looked at his face, so serious, so sure of himself in a way only children can be when they trust their instincts completely. I took a breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, I leaned forward and looked beneath the table, and in that instant, I understood why my grandson wanted to leave, and why this wedding was not the celebration it pretended to be. What I saw under the table didn't scream danger. That's what frightened me most. No blood, no weapon, no obvious horror that would justify a child's fear. Just shoes, men's shoes, lined neatly beneath the long tablecloth. too neatly, too many of them. They didn't belong to the guests sitting above them. I know shoes. I raised boys. I've tied laces in hospital waiting rooms and funeral halls and gymnasiums that smelled of floor polish and nerves. These shoes were polished black, identical, positioned with a care that felt rehearsed. Oliver watched my face closely. "You see them now," he said, not asking. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I do." "They're not supposed to be there," he whispered. "They were there before everyone sat down." That detail landed heavily. Before the ceremony, before the music, before anyone could have drifted in casually and tucked their feet beneath the table. My fingers tightened around his. "Did you tell anyone else?" He shook his head. "Daddy said today is about being happy, and Mommy says not to make scenes." Of course she did. I straightened slowly, forcing my breathing to remain even. Around us, waiters moved smoothly between tables. Laughter rose and fell. No one seemed tense. No one seemed alert, which meant if something was wrong, it was meant to go unnoticed. I leaned toward Oliver again. "You did the right thing telling me." He exhaled, a small release, like he'd been holding that breath a long time. "What do we do now?" he asked. I scanned the room with new eyes, the exit doors, the staff, the way certain guests, men I didn't recognize, stood near the walls instead of sitting, watching rather than celebrating. I'd been to enough family gatherings to recognize when joy was being managed. "We're going to stand up," I said softly, "and we're going to walk outside like we suddenly remembered something important." "Will Daddy be mad?" Oliver asked. I hesitated. "I don't think Daddy is seeing what we're seeing," I said honestly. We rose together. I gathered my purse calmly, my movements unhurried. Years of politeness training served me well now. I nodded to the woman beside me, smiled like nothing was amiss. But as we stepped away from the table, I felt it, the shift. Eyes followed us. Not many, just enough. Oliver squeezed my hand harder. "They're looking," he whispered. "Yes," I said, "keep walking." As we passed the head table, my son glanced up. Our eyes met. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, then irritation. "Where are you going?" he asked lightly. "Fresh air," I replied. Oliver's overwhelmed. The bride didn't look at us. She was focused on her glass, her smile fixed. We reached the hallway just beyond the reception doors when I heard footsteps quicken behind us. "Mom," my son called. "Wait." I didn't, because in that moment, I realized something that chilled me far more than the shoes under the table. My grandson hadn't been frightened because he imagined danger. He had been frightened because he recognized it, the way only children do, before adults explain it away. And whatever was planned for this wedding, it required silence, which meant the most dangerous thing we could do was stay seated and smile. The hallway felt colder than the reception room, as if we had stepped out of a warm story and into the truth behind it. I stopped only when we reached the coat area. Oliver pressed himself against my side, his small body trembling now that we were out of sight. I wrapped my arm around him, steadying us both. "Grandma," he whispered, "are we in trouble?" "No," I said firmly. "You're brave, and brave people are not in trouble for noticing things." Behind us, my son's footsteps slowed. He didn't grab me. He didn't raise his voice, but the way he stood there, blocking the hallway just enough, told me more than words could have. "You're making this uncomfortable," he said quietly. "I'm taking my grandson home," I replied. "You could have waited," he said. "It's my wedding." I looked at him then, really looked. He was smiling, but his eyes were tight, not angry, worried. "Did you know," I asked softly, "that there are men hiding under the tables?" His face changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone watching to notice, but I saw it, a flicker of calculation. "Mom," he said, "you're misunderstanding something." "Am I?" I asked. Oliver's fingers dug into my sleeve. I felt his fear like an echo in my chest. "This isn't the time," my son continued. "There are guests, people watching." "Yes," I said, "I've noticed." A pause stretched between us. Music from the hall drifted faintly down the corridor, cheerful and cruel. "You always had a way of seeing more than you should," he said finally. The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were suddenly revealing. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Whatever you're doing, don't involve a child." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain it," I said. "Explain why my grandson felt afraid before I did." He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the reception hall, then back at us. "Go home," he said. "We'll talk later." It wasn't a request. I nodded once. "We will." As we turned away, Oliver looked back at his father. Their eyes met for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Daddy," Oliver said softly, "are the men going to come out later?" My son didn't reply. We left through the side exit, the cool evening air rushing over us like a release. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally allowed to surface. "Grandma," Oliver asked as we walked toward the parking lot, "did I do something bad?" I stopped and knelt in front of him, holding his face gently in my hands. "No," I said, "you did something very important." "What?" "You listened to yourself." As we drove away, the music from the wedding faded behind us, but the image stayed with me, polished shoes under white linen, hidden in plain sight, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, whatever that wedding was truly about, it wasn't love. And the cost of pretending otherwise would have been paid by someone too small to protect himself. That night, Oliver fell asleep almost the moment his head touched the pillow. Children do that when the danger has passed. They release it all at once. I sat beside him longer than usual, listening to his breathing even out, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest, my heart aching with a mix of pride and dread. When I finally turned off the lamp, the house felt too quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam as it curled upward. My hands still shook slightly. I kept seeing those shoes in my mind, how clean they were, how deliberate their placement felt. Nothing accidental about them. Nothing celebratory either. My phone buzzed. My son's name lit up the screen. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Mom," he said, forcing a calm that sounded thin even to himself. "You embarrassed me tonight." I closed my eyes. "That's what you're worried about." There was a pause. "You don't understand the situation." "Then help me understand," I said. "Why were there men hiding under tables at your wedding?" He exhaled sharply. "They weren't hiding. They were security." "For what?" I asked. "The cake." He didn't laugh. "There are things going on," he said carefully. "Business matters. People who needed reassurance." "By sitting under tables?" I asked. "By staying out of sight," he snapped, then softened his tone. "Look, Mom, I've made choices, complicated ones, but they don't involve you or Oliver." I felt something settle inside me then, a cold clarity. "They already did," I said, the moment my grandson felt afraid. Another silence. Longer this time. "You always assume the worst," he said finally. "No," I replied. "I assume children don't invent fear for no reason." He lowered his voice. "You shouldn't talk about this with anyone." There it was. Not denial, not reassurance, control. "I won't," I said, "but I won't pretend either." After we hung up, I sat alone in the dim kitchen, listening to the clock tick. I thought about how often we excuse what doesn't feel right because confronting it would unravel too much. Family, reputation, appearances. I'd done it myself years ago in quieter ways, but I wasn't young anymore. I had no future to protect by staying silent, only a child to protect by speaking up. The next morning, I called a friend of mine. Her husband had worked in city permits and private events for decades. I described what I'd seen. Carefully, casually. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she said, "That doesn't sound like security." My stomach tightened. "What does it sound like?" "It sounds like people who didn't want to be photographed," she replied. "Or counted." That word stayed with me all day. Counted. That afternoon, a news alert popped up on my phone. Small article, buried deep, an investigation. A private company. Unlicensed personnel operating at public events. No names yet, but the date listed was yesterday, the day of the wedding. I looked toward Oliver's room, where he was building towers on the carpet, humming softly again. And I realized something that made my chest ache. If he hadn't spoken up, if I had told him to ignore that feeling, we wouldn't have just stayed for cake. We would have stayed until something went terribly wrong. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw white tablecloths hiding too many secrets. I heard my son's voice, measured, careful, not the voice of a man celebrating love, but of someone managing risk. By morning, I knew one thing clearly. Whatever was unfolding, it wasn't over. Oliver ate his cereal quietly, unusually focused. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes searched my face. "Are we in trouble today?" he asked. "No," I said, brushing crumbs from his cheek, "but we're going to be careful." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Later that day, my daughter-in-law, my son's first wife, called me. Her voice shook before she even finished saying hello. "I heard you left the wedding early," she said. "Oliver told me something strange." I hesitated. Then I told her the truth. Not every detail, but enough. She went very quiet. "He told me he didn't like the men under the tables," she said finally. "I thought it was imagination." "It wasn't," I replied. She exhaled sharply. "I knew something felt wrong when he insisted on taking Oliver for the entire weekend." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. "He insisted?" I asked. "Yes. He said it was important Oliver be there, that he needed to see his father happy." I closed my eyes. Children don't see danger because they're innocent. They see it because they haven't been taught yet what to ignore. That afternoon, another news update appeared. Still vague, still careful, but clearer now. Authorities were questioning staff at multiple venues. Events involving private gatherings, weddings included. I imagined reporters arriving at that hall hours after we left. I imagined questions, explanations, smiles stretched too thin, and I imagined Oliver sitting quietly beneath that table, feet dangling, watching things adults hoped no one would notice. My phone buzzed again. A message from my son. "We need to talk. In person." I stared at the screen for a long time. Some conversations, once started, don't end the way families hope they will. I agreed to meet him the next morning, neutral place, public daylight. No children. That night, I tucked Oliver into bed and kissed his forehead. "You did something good," I whispered. He frowned slightly in his sleep, then relaxed. As I turned off the light, one thought pressed heavy on my chest. Whatever my son had entangled himself in, it required silence, obedience, and distraction. And my grandson had nearly been used as part of the scenery. The next day would decide whether this story ended with honesty or with a family learning how easily love can be used as cover. We met the next morning at a small cafe near the courthouse. Neutral ground, plenty of windows, too many witnesses for anyone to raise their voice. My son arrived early. That alone told me how serious this was. He looked tired. Not the pleasant exhaustion of newlyweds, but the brittle kind that comes from keeping too many plates spinning. "You shouldn't have left like that," he said as I sat down. "You shouldn't have put a child in a room where fear was necessary," I replied calmly. He rubbed his temples. "You don't understand how close everything was to falling apart." "Then explain it," I said, slowly, honestly. For a moment, he stared at the table between us, as if deciding which version of himself to bring into the conversation. "There are people I owe," he said finally. "Not money. Favors." My chest tightened. "From what?" "From before the divorce. From before I thought my life could be clean again." He swallowed. "The wedding was leverage, proof of stability, respectability." "And the men under the tables?" I asked. "Insurance," he said quietly. "They weren't supposed to interact. Just observe." "Observe whom?" I asked. He hesitated. Guests who might talk, he said. The words hung between us like smoke. I thought of Oliver's small hand gripping mine, of the way his voice trembled, not confused, not playful, but alert. You used your own child as camouflage, I said. He flinched. I didn't think. No, I said. You decided. He looked up then, eyes wet with something like shame. I thought I could control it, that if everyone looked happy, nothing bad would happen. I leaned forward. That's what people say right before everything goes wrong. Silence settled. Cups clinked nearby. Life carried on. They're investigating, he said at last. If my name surfaces, it will, I said gently. And it should. He stared at me. You'd let that happen. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. I would not protect a lie at the cost of a child's safety. Tears slipped down his face then, unguarded and sudden. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he whispered. I know, I said, but meaning well doesn't undo consequences. When we stood to leave, he looked smaller somehow, less certain, like a man finally understanding the weight of the choices he'd made. As I walked back to my car, I felt no victory, only resolve. Because some lessons don't come gently, and some truths arrive through the mouths of children before adults are brave enough to hear them. And as painful as it was, I knew this much. Oliver had saved us from something far worse by refusing to stay quiet. The investigation didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, the way serious things often do. 2 days after my conversation with my son, a woman knocked on my door just after noon. She wore a simple blazer, no badge on display, and spoke my name carefully, as if testing how it sounded in the open air. I'm with the city, she said. We're following up on an event held last weekend. I invited her in. Oliver was at school. I was grateful for that. Some truths don't belong in a child's afternoon. She asked calm questions. Who I was seated with, when I noticed something felt wrong. Whether anyone discouraged me from leaving, I answered honestly, without embellishment. At my age, there's no benefit in drama, only in clarity. When I mentioned Oliver, her pen paused. A child noticed first, she asked. Yes, I said, and that's what troubles me most. She nodded slowly. It usually is. After she left, I sat alone in the living room, the quiet pressing in again. I thought about how easily things could have gone another way, how close I came to dismissing Oliver's fear as nerves or imagination. That night my son called. I spoke to my lawyer, he said. They're widening the inquiry. I waited. I might lose things, he added. Reputation, work, people. You might, I said gently, but you won't lose your son if you start choosing him now. He didn't respond right away. I keep seeing his face, he said finally. How scared he was. That's not punishment, I replied. That's conscience. Days turned into weeks. My son stepped back from certain commitments. The wedding photos never made it online. The bride stayed silent, her smile gone from public view. Some guests began to talk quietly. Others pretended nothing had happened. Life rearranged itself. Oliver asked fewer questions than I expected. Children often do. Once they feel safe, they move on. But sometimes, when we baked cookies or walked to the park, he would look up at me and ask, "We're okay, right?" "Yes," I always said, "we are." One afternoon, while watching him play, I realized something that brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't just protected him that day. He had protected me from the habit of minimizing discomfort, from the reflex to keep the peace at any cost, from the old belief that elders should stay quiet to avoid rocking the family boat. I was done with that. I met my son again weeks later. This time, there were no defenses left between us, only honesty and the slow work of repair. "I'm sorry," he said, not to excuse himself, not to explain, just sorry. I accepted it, not because everything was fixed, but because remorse is the first step toward change. Families don't always survive the truth, but sometimes, if you're lucky, they grow stronger because of it. And every time I hear Oliver laugh, now free and unafraid, I'm reminded of something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Wisdom doesn't always come with age. Sometimes it comes from a small voice at a crowded table brave enough to say, "Grandma, we shouldn't be here." Life did not snap back into place. After that, it softened into a new shape. The investigation moved quietly, then slowly faded from my daily awareness. I wasn't called again. I wasn't asked to testify. Some things resolve themselves in ways that never make the evening news, but still leave marks on the people involved. My son began showing up differently. He called more often. He listened longer. When Oliver spoke, he stopped what he was doing and gave him his full attention. Not out of guilt, but intention. That mattered. One afternoon, months later, we attended a small birthday party for a neighbor's child. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, paper plates bent under slices of cake, and adults chatted in loose circles. Ordinary. Safe. I watched Oliver playing on the grass, laughing without hesitation. At one point, he wandered over and sat beside me, leaning his head against my arm. "Grandma," he said casually, "sometimes grown-ups forget to look." I smiled. "Yes, they do. But they can remember," he added. "Yes," I said again, my voice thick now. "They can." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone with that thought. How often in my life had I ignored small signals because it felt easier? How many times had I told myself not to overthink, not to question, not to disturb the moment? We praise children for being obedient, but we survive because some of them aren't. This story isn't about a wedding or hidden men or even my son's mistakes. It's about listening, especially when the warning doesn't arrive wrapped in authority or certainty. Sometimes it arrives trembling. Sometimes it arrives small. Sometimes it arrives holding your hand under a table. If I've learned anything worth passing on, it's this: pay attention when a child grows quiet instead of loud. when fear appears without drama, when instinct speaks before logic can explain. Because danger doesn't always announce itself loudly, and safety doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks like standing up calmly, gathering your things, and choosing to leave, even when everyone else is still smiling. And sometimes the wisest voice in the room belongs to the youngest person at the table. Years from now, people will remember that wedding as a brief, awkward chapter, something that didn't quite turn out the way everyone expected. The photographs were never framed. The story was never told in full. Time did what it always does and smoothed the edges for those who preferred not to look too closely. But for me, the memory stayed sharp, not painful, just precise. One afternoon, long after the questions had faded and the house had settled back into its familiar rhythm, Oliver sat across from me at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. He was older now, taller, more confident. Childhood had begun to wrap him in its usual layers of noise and certainty. Out of nowhere, he looked up and asked, "Grandma, did I get Daddy in trouble?" I set down my tea. "No," I said gently. "You helped him." He frowned, but he was upset. "Sometimes," I said, "people are upset because the truth finds them before they're ready." He considered that, then nodded once, satisfied in the way children are when something feels right even if they don't fully understand it. That night, after he went to bed, I thought about how easily that day could have gone another way. How close I'd been to telling him not to fuss. How instinctively I'd almost chosen comfort over clarity. I've learned that regret doesn't always come from what we do. Sometimes it comes from what we dismiss. My son and I are rebuilding something now, not what we had before, but something more honest, slower, less polished. We don't pretend anymore. And while that makes some moments uncomfortable, it also makes them real. I don't attend large celebrations the same way now. I choose seats near exits. I watch faces more than decorations, and I pay attention when silence enters a room uninvited. Not because I'm afraid, because I'm awake. People sometimes tell me I was brave that day. I smile when they say it, but inside I know the truth. I wasn't brave. I was attentive. Bravery is loud. Attention is quiet. And quiet is what saved us. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing my story, it's this. When something small feels wrong, don't rush to explain it away. When a child's fear doesn't look dramatic, don't assume it's harmless. And when your instincts speak softly, lean in. Because danger doesn't always demand your attention. Sometimes it waits patiently, under a table, beneath a smile, hoping no one thinks to look. And in the final moments of my story, there's one truth I hold closest to my heart. The day I trusted my grandson, I didn't just protect him. I remembered how to trust myself. And that lesson, that quiet, life-saving lesson, is one I will carry with me for the rest of my days. When I look back now, what surprises me most isn't the danger. It's how ordinary the moment felt before everything shifted. A wedding table, white cloth, soft music, a child swinging his legs beneath his chair. We expect life-changing moments to arrive loudly, with alarms, with certainty. But the truth is, the most important turning points often whisper, and if we're not careful, we train ourselves to ignore them. I've lived a long life. I've buried loved ones, celebrated milestones, forgiven things I once swore I never would. And still, that day taught me something new, something I wish I'd learned much earlier. We spend so much time teaching children to listen to adults. We forget how often adults need to listen to children. Oliver didn't have facts. He didn't have explanations. He didn't even have words big enough to describe what he felt. But he had instinct and the courage to speak it aloud. And I had a choice. I could have smiled politely. I could have stayed seated. I could have told him everything was fine. Instead, I stood up. That's all it took. Not confrontation, not accusations, just the quiet refusal to remain where something felt wrong. Families don't like those moments. They disturb the picture. They raise questions no one wants to answer. But pretending comes at a cost, and too often, children are the ones asked to pay it. My relationship with my son is different now. Not broken, not perfect, just honest. And honesty, I've learned, is a kind of love too, one that protects instead of performs. As for Oliver, he's grown more confident with time. He still trusts his feelings. I make sure of that. Whenever he hesitates, whenever he grows quiet, I remind him gently. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story touched you, please tap the like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from or sharing a small part of your own story.